Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this Tuesday afternoon Faraday Research Seminar. My name is Keith Fox. I'm the director of the Faraday Institute, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all listening online. Our speaker today is Dr. Emily Burdett. Let me tell you a few things about her background. She graduated in psychology from Azusa Pacific University, and she has a master's degree in clinical psychology from California State University. She then completed a DPhil in Oxford, researching the cognitive, cultural, and developmental foundation of children's understanding of God and humans. And then following her PhD, she was a research fellow in the University of St. Andrews and is now assistant professor in the School of Psychology at the University of Nottingham, while she still retains a research associate post with the University of Oxford. Emily, it's a pleasure to welcome you today to speak to us. And your talk is entitled Exploring the Foundations of Religious Behaviour, and I'll hand over to you.
Great. Let me just share my screen. Great, thank you. It's a pleasure to be invited to the Faraday. I've spoken here previously and have always had a warm reception and great discussion afterwards. So I look forward to that following my talk. So just to give you a little bit of background, so my talk is called the Exploring the Foundations of Religious Behavior. And before we launch, and I just wanted to give a little bit of background of myself about how I started researching this topic. Hold on, my slides aren't moving. Let me just share again for some reason. Apologies. There we go. Okay, so I don't know if you can tell from my accent, but I'm originally from the USA, from California, actually from Silicon Valley. And as Keith said, I did my undergrad at Azusa Pacific and then went on to do a DPhil at Oxford and have held some fellowships at St. Andrews and now am at the University of Nottingham. And my expertise, I'm a developmental psychologist, so I work a lot with children all across the world. During my DPhil, I was interviewing and working with children in Albania and in Israel, but have done a variety of different things now. So working in a variety of different countries, and I'm part of a huge network called the Developing Belief Network. So it's the first work that right now we have 30 sites globally, and we're trying to understand the nature of belief. So how children come to understand God as well as other supernatural agents and how they develop religious behavior and belief in God. So stay tuned. It's a 5-year project. It's just beginning. So if you are interested in any of the questions that I talk about, you can check that out. It's called the Developing Belief Network. I think it's .org if you're interested. So the methods I use are behavioral. So we do lots of fun tasks. You'll see a few in this talk. And I also have done some evolutionary comparative work. So actually working with other species. So the nature of this talk, so a lot of people, decades and decades of research have gone into understanding why people do the things they do in religion. So why is there ritual? Why is there certain doctrines? And people have wondered about the origins of this. And so what I want to talk a little bit about first is the history of what other people have looked at. And then during the last 3 decades, we've been moving away from classic theories to something called the cognitive science of religion. So I want to explain to you what this is, give you some examples as well. So we'll talk about some of the historical approaches. I'll tell you about CSR, so that's the cognitive science of religion. And then I'll tell you what these people have been saying, how we develop these religious ideas and behavior. And then I just want to give you a little glimpse of what some modern debates are in this field, because I think they're quite interesting. So hopefully you'll find them interesting as well. So just a quick slide on some of the classic approaches to the study of religion. If you've taken a philosophy, psychology, or anthropology class, you'll probably recognize some of these names. I won't go into too much detail about what each of them have said. There'll be another slide that briefly talks about kind of their general approach to religion. But nowadays, people are talking about a cognitive approach to the study of religion. So it's a similar aim. We're trying to understand religious behavior, but a slightly different approach, a more experimental approach to looking at this. And cognitive science doesn't just mean we look at cognition from a psychological perspective. It also includes linguistics, computer science, philosophy, anthropology, and archaeology, and neuroscience. So there's quite a bit of different fields involved in this new line of research. Something in my own field. So this is Jean Piaget. He was one of the first developmental psychologists, and he was actually one of the first to actually talk about how children develop ideas about humans and ideas about God. And he did a lot of interviews with children. And based on his work, he thought that children couldn't have a complex understanding about who God is until they were at least 7. But with some of the research I'll be showing you with children, we know that children actually can have quite complex ideas about God younger than 7. So I'll explain to you some of those later. So how did CSR begin? So it's still fairly new. So in the 1990s, a group of scholars, they were really dissatisfied with the more classical approaches to religion. So that previous slide with Freud and Tyler. And there were 4 particular areas that they weren't happy with. So I'll just tell you these 4 areas and then go into them in the next few slides. So the first is that religion is only a product of culture, that all religions are unique, that religion cannot be explained, and that religion is a single phenomenon and can be explained by a single principle. So let me just unpack these a bit. So this first one, that religion is only a product of culture. So this is the assumption that religion is only a product of environment and culture. And what CSR is trying to say is that a lot of these classical approaches have avoided or not addressed the role of the mind. So we all have certain biases in how we think. And so what CSR is trying to show in experiments is that this ability to think about the world in a certain way actually biases us to think about God. And what they want to say is, why should religion be any different to how we think about cognition? In the second one, so all religions are unique. So what they want to push back is that actually religions can be different. And that actually there are lots of things that actually are very similar with religions. So there's sometimes the beliefs can be very different, but there are some aspects that are very similar. So certain ways of prayer, certain ways of thinking about God. So they want to push back and show what are actually the similar parts about religion. And then the third one was that religion cannot be explained. So a lot of people in CSR say, well, there's actually some bits that we can look back. We can kind of talk about in a reductionist sense, divide religion up into various parts. So this is also a criticism of CSR, is that we look at little bits of religion. Trying to do is look at little bits of religion so we can look eventually at the whole big picture of what religion represents. So if we can look at little bits like perhaps ritual, if we can look at the evolution of prayer, if we can look at how children or adults, the qualities they attribute to God, if we can look about all these different things, what can we understand about religion? And then finally, a lot of them were dissatisfied with these classic theories of religion. So they were big, grand theories, but they could only talk about basically one aspect. So Tyler, he thought it was the belief in supernatural agents. Freud, that God is a father figure, and religion provides a solution to the fear of death. So it was a very narrow focus. And so CSR tries to be much more broad. So let's just talk about CSR a little bit more specifically. I'm not going to go into this slide. This basically reiterates what I've just been saying the last 5 slides. But just some things to note that so religion can be explained by using empirical methods. So a lot of the stuff that I'll be showing with you, we use empirical methods to look at specific aspects of religion. So we'll show you this. So Justin Barrett, he's one of the founding researchers of CSR, and this is just his definition of what it is. So it draws upon the cognitive sciences. So again, all those different fields. To explain how cults inform and constrain religious thought and action, and how do particular religious, cultural, and environmental factors stretch or modify these cognitive defaults. So you can see that it's an interaction between cognition and also the cultural and environmental aspects. So the CSR, there's three things that CSR tries to do and tries to explain. One is the presence of religious ideas and behavior, so how they've emerged throughout time. The other is the persistence. So not only have these ideas emerged, but they've persisted for many, many, many decades, centuries. So a long time. So why is it that these continue to persist? And then the prevalence, how these ideas have become popular and stayed popular for millennia. So one of the reasons why they think this has persisted and why it is so popular is that religion is just as important as other cognitive aspects of the mind. So a lot of people assume that religion can be studied by any other cross-cultural human tendency or behavior. Religion is natural, it's part of human behavior. So these two gentlemen right here wrote this book, Why Religion is Natural and Science is Not. Science actually takes a lot of cultural scaffolding to understand scientific knowledge. What they're arguing in their book, they're both philosophers, is that religion is very natural. It comes intuitively. We don't need a lot of scaffolding to understand religious behavior and religious ideas. It's a very interesting book. I do recommend it. And they also suggest that there's two aspects of religion. There's a theologically correct religion. So this is the scaffolding that you need to understand certain doctrines, certain teaching, the folk religion. So these are kind of the intuitive ideas that people have about God, about how one should engage with others. So a lot of the experiments that I'll be showing you are actually tapping into the more of the intuitive side of religion. So how people develop a certain idea about God, for example. If you have more questions about this, please feel free to ask at the end. And there's been some criticism of this, of course. So Richard Dawkins would say that then this is evidence that religion is just all in mind. Whereas others, like theologians, would say that this is evidence that religion is true, that God created human minds to think about God, to think about religion. So obviously CSR, they don't have any, we don't speak about these issues. These are more, we talk about the quantitative aspects of how these ideas arise. We don't have any kind of personal aspects of this, but you can see how different sides of people may interpret this data. So finally, just the general assumption about the mind. We think about the mind as like a Swiss Army knife. So your mind has lots of tools to be able to think about the world. And I'll explain to you what I mean by that. But we come into the world with this kind of conception of how it can be. And we have these intuitive notions about how the world works. So I'll first show you how this works. So how do we develop religious ideas? So let me just have a brief exploration about some of these cognitive mechanisms. So I'll talk about four, there's many more, but I just want to give you a glimpse of what I mean. The first is called theory of mind, and it's our idea of how we understand other people and other agents. And then there's the hypersensitivity agency detection device, also known as HAD, because that's quite a mouthful. And then there's minimal counterintuitive ideas, MCI is the abbreviation, and then promiscuous teleology. And I'll explain to you what each of these are. So remember that Swiss Army knife. This is an example of by some of the things of what we mean by this. So religious ideas, they usually come about because of how we think about the natural world. So for example, infants and children, they come to the world learning about how things work. So in infancy, there's these amazing experiments where you get children to watch, for example, gravity. So an experiment will drop a ball and it will hit the floor, and the infant is not surprised by this. However, they've rigged some kind of experimental method where they drop a ball and it suspends in air. And of course, that's surprising. As adults, we would be surprised at this because balls just don't stop in the air. Infants do the same thing. They will stop and stare for a long time at this ball because they know, even in their short life on Earth, they know that balls just don't suspend in the air. So there's lots of these kinds of experiments that developmental psychologists do to kind of fool with babies to see by their surprise. If they are surprised that something works, or if they look bored, then they don't see anything surprising about a certain display. So there's lots of experiments about physics, how things drop, whether something goes by itself. So there's experiments where they have a ball that will move by itself. Infants look surprised at that, just like adults would, because balls, they're not agents. They can't move by themselves. So it's through these types of methods that we can understand how children understand the natural world. And then we also know with theory of mind. So they do lots of experiments about children interacting or watching how people behave. We know that when kids are surprised, they say how someone's behaved or not behaved, that there's some indication that it's surprising or not. And I'll explain theory of mind a little bit in more detail later. But there's also one about biology. So there's experiments how children understand. For example, they know that cats have kittens, and cats don't have dinosaurs or crocodiles. They know that baby animals grow up to be bigger and older. It's not the opposite. So there's lots of things that kids tend to develop and grow and can tell you about the state of the natural world. And it's through this understanding about the natural world that they can then think about the supernatural world. So because children know how the natural world works, when something different happens, so like when an object is flying or suspended, they're surprised. And that's when it's attention grabbing. They start to think about, why is that? Is that supernatural? Is there something going on? So let's talk about some of these more cognitive mechanisms. So theory of mind, which I have been mentioning. So this is our ability to attribute mental states such as intuitions or intentions, feelings, emotions, beliefs, knowledge, and desires. So let me tell you how this is tested. So theory of mind develops somewhere between 3 and 5 years old. And this is a test that's been used globally all across the world. And it does, there are certain cultures that develop this earlier, some later, but it's usually around between 4 and 5 that children develop the ability to really think that another person can have a different thought or a different preference. So there's a variety of different tasks. The most popular one is this one. So you show children some kind of box with something on the outside that they think that they probably would be familiar with. So this is a cracker box that's used in the USA. So you would show this box to a child and you'd say, okay, I have this box. What do you think is inside this box? And most kids who are familiar with it would say, there's crackers inside this box. And then you open it up and say, actually, I've put rocks inside this box. And then you close it up and say, okay, what's actually inside this box? And kids say rocks. So in order to test theory of mind, you want to see if children will understand that another person can have a false belief about what is inside. So the test of this is you ask, okay, so let's pretend your mom walked into the room. What do you think your mom would say is inside the box? And kids that haven't developed theory of mind are very cute and say, oh, mom knows there's rocks inside the box, because it's very hard for them to understand that someone else would be fooled by this, because they themselves know there's rocks inside the box. So they assume someone else also knows that there's rocks inside the box. The kids who really have developed this to understand that other people can have different beliefs, they would say, okay, mom didn't see that you show me there's rocks inside the box, so she's probably fooled and thinks that there's crackers. So we say kids don't pass this test if they say that mom says there's rocks inside the box, and they do pass this test when they can say that mom probably is fooled and think there's crackers inside the box. So I just want to show you a quick little video. This is a 3-year-old. Hopefully you all can hear this.
Do you know what this is? Crayons. If I open the box, what would be inside?
Crayons.
Good. Let's open the box and see what's inside. What's inside?
M&M's.
M&M's. What's really inside the box?
M&M's.
M&M's? Before I opened it, what did you think was inside the box?
Crayons.
That's right. I'm going to close the box now. Now Jenna is outside. If Jenna comes back in the room, what will she say is inside the box?
Great. So that 3-year-old did not have theory of mind. So she wasn't able to think that Jenna would know that there was actually M&M, or actually, I'm getting confused. She would be fooled, and she would think that there is crayons inside the box. So she said that Jenna would know that there's M&Ms. Okay, let's move on to the next cognitive mechanism. So this is HAD. I'll just shorten it for ease of saying this. And before I explain it, I'll just show you a video. So what I want you to do is you watch it. It's just to watch it, and then I'll ask you a few questions afterwards. Oops. Oopsies. Here we go. Play. There's no sound. This was a study that was done in the 40s by Hyder and Simmel, and they were testing something completely different, and they were asking participants to describe what they were viewing. So if I could ask you, a lot of times when I've asked people to describe what's going on here, a lot have said, oh, there's some bullying going on, there's a chase going on. And just by talking about that, we're talking about triangles and shapes here. We're not talking about actual humans or agents. So that's the HAD coming into place, the hypersensitivity agency detection device, is that we're attributing agency when there really isn't any agents there. So it's so easy for us. We're hypersensitive to detecting agents in the environment. So people in CSR think that one of the reasons why we're so quick to attribute supernatural agency when we can't explain something is that we're so quick to thinking about agents in the environment, or in displays like this, in a movie about shapes. So if you think about this, it's so easy for us to attribute 2 eyes and a nose or a mouth, where in here we don't attribute a face, whereas we see all different kinds of faces and agents throughout our environment, and we attribute agency. I'm sure Henry the vacuum, we attribute more than just a face. If it's not working, or say, oh, Henry's grumpy today. So we do this all the time. Another mechanism is called intuitives. And so this is the idea that supernatural religious ideas are particularly interesting. And it's because they violate intuitive notions about the natural world. So the slide where I was talking about, like for intuitive physics, that babies seem to understand the idea of gravity, even though they wouldn't be able to tell you, of course, what gravity is. They seem to understand intuitively what it is. And so because they know this, they know that it's surprising if that ball violates our intuitive notion of how the natural world works. It's because it's surprising, it's interesting. So when something's interesting, we want to talk about it. So the reason why some people think that religious ideas persist and I think are popular is because they violate kind of intuitive notions of the world. So when we talk about a miracle, when we talk about certain types of things that God can do. Those are surprising. That's something that humans cannot do. So this is one of the reasons why they think that religion and a lot of religious ideas and doctrines have stayed around, because they're worth talking about, because they're so interesting and they violate expectations about how we know about the world. But the interesting thing about this theory is it's not maximal. So these violations aren't a lot, they're minimal. So it's the idea that a toaster can smile, or that there's, a fairy that can live forever, or, there's a ghost that has no body or that can move through walls. But they're not maximal in the sense that it's a toaster that can only smile on Tuesdays, something that's very maximally and kind of hard to understand. These are almost like little sound bites or little aspects of things that tweak our understanding of the natural world. We did test this. So Justin Barrett and I, we did look through the mythical record. So myths, of course, are transmitted and they obviously have stood the test of time. So we were interested in coding a bunch of myths globally, and just to see if any kind of MCI agents that we could code for were actually minimally counterintuitive if they violated one or two aspects. So a person without a body or a person that could live forever, those are violations of one type of intuitive notion. And that's exactly what we found. So if you see in this graph here, so along the x-axis, you've got numbers from 0 to 11. So there actually was a myth that had an agent with 11 different things that were counterintuitive about it. But most of them fall into that category of having one or two things that are different. So, and there's been lots of other work with this, so some that support this theory, some that don't, but it does seem to be on the whole that a lot of ideas seem to be minimally counterintuitive. And the question I often get to is, well, God's maximally counterintuitive. There's lots of things that are countered, especially if you think about Jesus. He's very maximally counterintuitive. But the thing, when we talk about Jesus, we usually talk about him in only one aspect. So when he rose from the dead, or when he performed a miracle, those are minimally counterintuitive. We can't seem to hold certain ideas that are maximal. Okay, and this last one is a term that I love using. It's called promiscuous teleology. This was a term coined by Deb Kellerman, who came up with these experiments. And what she was noticing with children is that in adults, we tend to prescribe function and purpose to things that shouldn't have any function or purpose. And she created these questions to get at with kids if they actually do this kind of thinking. So she would ask them, why do you think the rocks are so pointy? And children responded, they're pointy so that animals wouldn't sit on them and smash them, instead of something and a response that should be, they were pointy because bits of stuff piled up on top of one another for a long time. Here's some other examples. Why did the first ever bird exist? To make nice music, because it made the world look nice. Or why did the first mountain exist? They made mountains so people can look at them. So interesting, they're already attributing creation there. Why did the first river exist? So that people could do fishing. So they're attributing purpose to these things, rather than talking about how they probably actually came about. And this idea, what she thinks is actually why a lot of children, it's much more intuitive to think about intelligent design than it is to think about evolution. And this is why I think it's such a sticking point sometimes for people to understand how evolution works. It's very, very tricky. So she extends those previous questions by asking them. So we've been talking about mountains or rivers, monkeys, birds. Now here's the question. Did someone or something make the first ever mountain exist, or did it just happen? So under half of children said someone made the natural events. Over half said someone made natural objects. And 73% said that someone made animals. And then she went further. So she asked about these different things. And she said, was it made by people? Was it made by God? Does no one know? And children were 7 times more likely to say that God made the natural objects. In a further study that used this by Margaret Evans, she's a researcher at the University of Michigan, she decided to ask children about where these 3 things came from. So a sun, and a human being. And what she did was she asked children in fundamentalist Christian homes and also children raised in atheist homes. And what she found was that no matter what type of family these children were being brought up, children offered more creationist accounts, regardless of background, and spontaneous accounts, even when parents never offer a spontaneous account or a creationist account. So even when parents teach about evolution, children below the age of 8 were still offering more creationist accounts. And it seems to be because we have this intuition to think about someone created these natural objects, someone created these animals. It's really hard for us to understand evolution. So since then, Deb Kellerman has actually created books to help children understand evolution and just the complexities of it. And they argue that this is the reason why it's so easy for us to think about God and that God created the world. But children aren't just totally incredulous and they believe in anything. So it might just seem that children will believe in God or believe in anything below the age of 8, but they're actually not. They're very good about understanding what's real and what's not. So Paul Harris, he's a researcher at Harvard, and he was very interested in how much children really believe this kind of thing. And he was asking 5- and 6-year-olds about different types of agents. So he talked about what he calls non-endorsed entities. So things like mermaids and ghosts, so things we talk about in myths, but no one actually uses the language that they believe in these things. Then he talks about endorsed entities. So these are actual agents that people would say, I believe in God, or I would believe in the tooth fairy. And then also scientific entities. So talking about germs and oxygen. So things also we cannot see, we'll kind of have to take for granted and believe someone that they actually exist, but we probably don't use the term, I believe in germs. What he found was, so he asked children whether they existed or not. And children were very good. So they thought that God existed and that germs existed, but they weren't really convinced that mermaids and ghosts and those kind of things existed. So this last one, just to show you, this is one of my favorite studies. It's called the Princess Alice study. And I'll show you a quick video. And this is a study by Jesse Bering. And what he wanted to show was that whether kids, if they believe in a supernatural being, if their behavior actually changes. And what he did was he set up an experiment where children had to do a really tricky task. So he had them have a ball that they would have to throw over the back of their shoulder into a hoop. But the experimenter would leave the room. And he was interested to see if children would actually cheat at this task. And there were different conditions. There was one where children were just left alone and they could do that. And they would get a special prize if they got so many balls inside the basketball hoop. Another condition where they said that Princess Alice is actually in the room. She likes to sit in this empty chair here in the room. So I'm going to be leaving the room, but remember that Princess Alice is in that chair watching you. And then another condition where the experimenter actually sat in the chair and watch the child do this activity. So I'll show you the condition with the Princess Alice in the chair, and then I'll explain what's happened. There's no sound. Sorry, it's not a basketball hoop, it was darts. So you could see this boy, he was actually testing. So for a while he said, well, is she in there? And then he goes to sit on the chair to test it out to see if she's there. She's not. And then you hear him say she's not real. So he was actually trying to see if it was convincing or not. So I love that study just because it's a common response that kids have. So just with these examples of these cognitive mechanisms, it just shows that we have an incredible capacity to learn about the world. And these same mechanisms are the same ones that help us to think about the supernatural. So other topics that people in CSR cover, they look at how ritual has evolved and the purpose of ritual, also the ideas of magic and where that comes from, how religious ideas are spread across cultures and it's spread across religions, aspects of prayer and what people believe in and don't believe in about prayer, reincarnation, also about understanding the soul and spirit possession. So these are obviously looking at kind of cross-culturally some of these beliefs. And in the final minutes of the talk, I want to talk to you about some current perspectives and debates that are in the field. And I think these are quite exciting because I think it shows actually some more advanced methods that people are using to look at some of these ideas. So how do we come to conceptualize God? So the research questions for this is, so this is more my work. So how do children conceptualize and evaluate the variety of minds they come into contact with? So things like humans, could be non-human animals, supernatural agents. How do they distinguish between a lot of these different agents? So Dr Burdett, he was the person that really started this work, and he's done a lot of studies and books and work about this. And what he's come to conclude is that children are born believers. Deb Kalman, who we talked about earlier with the promiscuous teleology, she also thinks that children are intuitive theists. So based on this, the theory of mind and promiscuous teleology, it's just easy for children to think about God and supernatural agents. The original study that kickstarted this, was Justin Barrett gave children the crackers and rocks theory of mind task. And he asked children about a variety of agents, including their mom, God, a bear, an elephant, snake, and tree. And what you see, so the ages are at the bottom, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And you see that across 3 to 6, children don't change their response about God. They think that God knows there's rocks inside the box at all ages. But you see between 4 and 5, when they develop theory of mind, then they understand that all these other agents, they wouldn't know that there's actually rocks inside the box because they're not omniscient. But until then, 3-year-olds are quite gullible and think that all agents think that there's rocks inside the box. Jonathan Lane has done some other work, same task, but using slightly different methods, and asked about different various supernatural agents. And he finds that it's between 4 and 5, so this middle period, when children are starting to understand theory of mind, that they get a little bit confused. So they may attribute at a young age everything, but then they even get confused about God. So you see that little gray line at the very bottom, that's God. They get a little bit confused, even with God, what his response would be. For me, I've done this cross-culturally in the UK, in Israel, Kenya, and the Dominican Republic. And we asked them about God and about a variety of different types of agents. And what we find are very different patterns across different cultures. So God in all of these is the dotted black line. And you could see very different trajectories across these different cultures. But you can see that the line is always quite low, meaning children are actually really good about responding about what God would know. But they're very variable with the other agents. So mom is the dark, solid line. They tend to, looks like in the very beginning, attribute her with omniscience, but then across development, then attribute her with actually she doesn't know what's inside the box. And then the other agents, so we talk about angels, we talk of SWEC as an agent that we came up with. We came up with a supernatural agent that's supposed to be like God, so this agent knows everything. So kids were also quite good about reasoning about SWEC, so someone that knows everything, though not quite as good as understanding God. And then the other ones, like the sun god, the ancestors, and angels, children were less good. So these are lesser supernatural agents. Perhaps they might be more maximally counterintuitive. So it's much more hard for children to think about these. So we think this is what's going on. Or it could be that it takes a lot of cultural scaffolding to understand these types of agents, whereas God is a concept that's fairly easy. If God is omniscient, he knows everything. He must know what's inside the box, whereas an angel or a sun god, it's not quite clear what they know. It may be harder to understand and to reason about what they would know in this task. So just a quote, and that section is from Scott Atran. He's a researcher. So supernatural agency is the most culturally recurrent, cognitively relevant, and evolutionarily compelling concept in religion. The concept of the supernatural is culturally derived from an innate cognitive schema. So this is just to reiterate that those cognitive mechanisms are super important when we're talking about supernatural agency. So the final a debate that I'd like to talk about is, so there's some researchers that are currently debating the evolutionary origins of religion, and particularly religious behavior. And just the background of this, one of the biggest puzzles in evolutionary history is how we moved from small tight-knit groups to big, large-scale societies. So there's lots of different theories about how this happened, and especially what inspired cooperation. It could be agriculture, it could be the development of justice systems, and some people believe it was the belief in gods or God. And there's two kind of main hypotheses. There's one that's called the moral high God hypothesis, so that the most successful religions and societies have high gods. So these are usually like the Christian God, it could be the Muslim God as well, or even the Jewish Hashem. So these bigger religious traditions have bigger overall societies. And it's because these bigger gods have the ability to punish transgressions. But there's also some hypotheses that show that there's actually more broad supernatural punishment hypotheses. So it could even include ancestral spirits or even processes like karma. So I'll show you some examples of some work from this. So Dominic Johnson, he's a researcher now at Oxford. And one of the first studies that was published on this was he looked at 186 societies across the globe and found that it seems that it's the moral high gods that seems to be driving large-scale cooperation. So this study was published in 2005, so a while ago. And he found that it seemed to be related to society size, also the lending of money, and certain norm enforcements that come from religion. But then in 2015, a study came out from Joseph Watts that showed, so he looked at the historical records in Austronesia, and he did a phylogenetic analysis. Please don't ask me about the methods for this. It's a very complicated analysis, and I don't understand all the ins and outs of what this is. But what he found was that in these societies, actually what's driving bigger societies is the supernatural, it's broad supernatural punishment and not just the moralizing high gods. And then there was a study in 2016 by Benjamin Grant Perzicki and colleagues where they gave some experiments to many different cultural groups. And what they had two conditions. So one, they had to roll a dice, and when they rolled, say, a purple, they could give some money to themselves. If they rolled a red, they were supposed to give money to someone in their tribe or their society. And another condition, they were supposed to roll a dice for purple, and it would be someone that they would give money to someone in their tribe or society. Whereas if they rolled a red, they were supposed to give it to a different tribe with a different religion, with a different belief system. And in both of these conditions, the researchers were away. So they were wondering, in these conditions, would these people cheat or not? And what they found was those who said in their society that they had gods who didn't punish or weren't kind of interested in human behavior, they were much more likely to cheat and put more coins into their own cups. Whereas those that said they had gods or high gods that were very morally interested in their behavior were much more likely to be truthful and not cheat. So this then is a study for the morally high gods hypothesis. Then, this was in 2019, Harvey Whitehouse at the University of Oxford, they decided to look through the historical record. They've created a database called SEISHAT, which is here. You can go and Google it if you like and look at their data. But it's a database full of societies. I think there's more than 414 now, but it's supposed to go back 10,000 years. And you can use this data to look at kind of the evolution of history. And what they found was that complex societies were created based on moralizing high gods. This is just a little sheet about how they actually created. If you're interested, I can explain how they created their data. And this is just a graph to show what occurred. So belief in moralizing gods occurred, after mega societies were created. So it's a big counterintuitive idea about this. And then this group, these are a bunch of people who are represented from Vancouver and the United Kingdom and New Zealand. They took the analyses from that paper and found that there was lots, they treated there's lots of absence of different societies. So the way the coding system works is that they say if a behavior was present or absent. So if the behavior is absent, it's kind of they're not sure why it's absent. So these people looked at the data points that said absent, and they didn't like the way the original paper treated that absent data. So they reanalyzed the data and actually found that when you correct for it, they actually show that moralizing high gods do precede complex societies. So it seems to be that moralizing gods are the driving force that create complex societies. But since then, and these people also have a separate database that they've created, if you're interested, called the Database of Religious History, which also has the goal of talking about religious cultural history from a quantitative and qualitative perspective. And then just this month, Harvey Whitehouse, so the original person and group that published this paper, they retracted their old paper based on the analyses that these people created, and have reanalyzed and addressed all of the points that the people, their criticisms. And now that they've reanalyzed the data and rechecked the data through experts and various other techniques and using more advanced statistics, they still find that big gods and moralizing high gods did not drive the rise of big societies. So again, there's this debate going back and forth about how you analyze data. And this, I think, captures also how science works, depending on the methods and the coding systems you use, the analyses you use, the hypotheses you have. Sometimes data can go back and forth depending on the data that you have. And you have to, of course, make sure that the data you have is correct. So I think this is a really interesting idea and an example of how science works. But anyway, hopefully you enjoyed that talk. You learned a little bit about what CSR is, some of the experiments that are involved, some of the ideas, the debates. If you're further interested, here's some books here that are kind of general introductions about various topics. I highly recommend each of these. But thank you very much for listening, and I welcome any comments or questions.
Emily, thank you ever so much for that overview of the whole subject. One thing I forgot to say at the beginning, if people have got questions, please do put them in the Q&A box, and I will then put them to Emily. So apologies for not saying that at the beginning. Do fire away with any questions or comments and put them in that box at the bottom. That was a great overview, Emily. At several stages, you talked about things changing in children between the ages of 3 and 5. I think, what actually happens? Is that, if you like, accumulated experience? Is there something physiologically going on in their brains? What actually happens between 3 and 5 to provoke that sort of change?
That's a great question. It's a blend of both. So children's brains are changing all the time. They're pruning as well. And there's something that's happening neurologically during that time and it's also based on experience. So that's why we see, I think, different experiences are developing this earlier, where it's not. But then we're seeing this pattern happens no matter what culture you're at. It happens at the same kind of general period. And that seems to be both a neurodevelopment as well as a cultural thing. So it's both. It's a blend of both.
Yeah, so I wondered, you were saying about when the child stops thinking that mum knows everything. Is that because they actually find an occasion when it's quite clear mum doesn't know, or is there some other underlying explanation?
I think you see this with kids all the time. There is a point where they know that, oh wait, mom doesn't know everything. A little epitome. They start to, a light goes on, a light bulb goes on. But we think, as social learning developmentalists, we think that it's really actually developmentally and evolutionarily really important that kids actually think their parents do know everything from a certain age, because they will listen and understand and perhaps survive longer because they think, oh, mom and dad know everything, so I should listen. But it's actually really start to think for themselves that mom and dad don't know everything, because they start then to think for themselves, okay, well, how would I do this? How would I do this differently? And they start to have some independence of thought. And actually it's good because school is just around the corner too, where they'll be thinking and problem solving for themselves. So it's a really neat, and a lot of people in development are so curious about this period because there's so much going on during that time about learning about from others and also about the world.
There's a few questions come in now. Let me take one here. Does an innate tendency to believe in God, do you think that has any evolutionary advantage?
Definitely. So most people in CSR are fascinated by religion because, and I think most of the people in the field are actually atheists, and I think they're fascinated by how much religion has persisted. But they're interested as they see the evolutionary survival advantage of it, because when you're part of religion, you're usually part of other people that look after you. People that look after you, you tend to be better fed, have better mental health. People are looking out for you. And so those advantages will then make you survive longer. I mean, there's also something to be said about having a belief system that you think about an afterlife. And so these people tend to have better mental health as well. There's the physical survival of having these bigger groups to look after you, but also the mental aspect as well. Does that answer the question?
Well, let's hope so.
Yeah.
Here's one actually that comes from somebody in our own youth and schools team here. And they find that young people ask big questions about life in the way that adults don't. Is that a cultural or a neurodevelopmental thing that makes children ask the why questions in a way that adults don't?
I like that question. I love it when kids ask questions, and I think there's a boldness to them that they're willing to ask questions that adults don't sometimes, that not only are more revealing, perhaps more pointed. And I think it's a variety of things. That there's a developmental part about it, that children sometimes they do tend to be more bold. They're not as scared to ask the deeper questions. They can break the norms a little bit and ask them. But also some of their questions are very basic. So, if they're asking about the origin of something, and they're not, I think, asking the same question that an adult would. The adult probably wants the methodology and kind of the deeper understanding. Kid kind of just wants to know, a little bit about the background and what you're thinking. So I think there is a difference, but I think in some ways what kids are asking, it's the basic question. And sometimes it's much harder to answer in a way that they understand. Yeah, so were you going to say something, Keith?
No, go on.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I think there is a difference, and I do enjoy the questions that kids ask. I think they're bolder. I think there is a developmental basis for it. I think it's the theory of mind aspect of it too. They're just not as curious about, I guess, the norms behind it and everything. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Here's a question about I think it was the hypersensitivity to the HAD that you described as your acronym. How do researchers know that that's not a result of culture and what has been learned already, rather than of nature itself?
That's a great question. So HAD is a mechanism that it's really hard to test. So unless you're put into a situation where you're in a room, and let's just say in another room, there's a loud bang, and then you try to test that person who just assumes, what they assume what that bang was about. Do they think it was a ghost in another room? Do they think it was another person? It's really hard to test this idea. There's been a lot of people that have looked at Hyder and Simmel movie, and that they've used that as a basis for thinking about agency. But a lot of the work that we have with this intuitive mechanism is just inferred. And so there's been a few tests what they've done with children, and it's been with mixed results. So this is a mechanism that we intuitively think this is what is going on, but we're still trying to figure out the right methods to use to really test this hypothesis and this mechanism. So I think of all the mechanisms that I talked about, the four, so theory of mind, promiscuous teleology, HAD, and MCI. MCI and HAD are probably the most debated. Theory of mind and promiscuous teleology, we have a lot of evidence for this, but the evidence for MCI and HAD are a bit more tricky because it's a little bit harder to understand these mechanisms in more empirical methods.
Okay, we tend to think, if you like, in black or white, sort of dichotomous thinking, either or. You pointed to a number of times when children talk about creation and see God as creator. At what stage are they able to accept, if we like, two ideas together, God and evolution, creation and evolution, not as being opposed to each other, but as two ways of looking at the same thing?
I'm so glad you asked that, because I realized I didn't get to talk about that thoroughly in the talk. So it seems to be, so children really, and with a lot of these ideas, around the age of 8, so it's after theory of mind is created, at around 8, children really start to be able to think for themselves. And it's about this time that we also see that they really start to take on board how evolution works. And it's also about the time that they really can start to integrate different ideas. So if they're from a home where they believe in God, they start to integrate. And especially if they've got examples about how to do this appropriately, they can do it very well. But again, I mean, adults really struggle with this as well, which is why BioLogos is there to help us think about these ideas and really bring them together. But we see it around 8 in a very simplified manner. Kids can start to do this, and it also coincides developmentally when they can start really thinking and problem solving for themselves.
Thank you. Our time is nearly up. Let me give you one sort of broad question right at the end. As to what do you think will be the most important or exciting questions in this field in the next 10 years?
Oh, I think more broadly, it's just the big data now that we have access to it. And I think the more, a lot of the new data analyses that are coming out, the bigger questions that we can ask about the evolution of societies and religions, I think we can track a lot more. So I'm excited to see, especially what these two groups that I talked about at the end, what they'll be coming up with and refining. So I think those are the very exciting things, with access to these huge databases and ideas. And certainly in my own field with development, I think we're getting better and better about refining our methods. So I think we're getting better and better about testing babies. So it'll be really interesting to see what we come up with, to see how babies think about God, perhaps, and other religious ideas. So I think stay tuned for those things.
Okay, thank you very much. It's been great listening to you today and hearing what you have to say to us. Thank you ever so much for being with us. I'm going to close in just a few minutes, and the rolling slides will go past in case anybody missed them at the beginning, to be able to see the things that the Faraday Institute are doing. If we were in person, we would give you a round of applause and there'd be lots of conversation afterwards. Unfortunately, we can't do that online, but we'll give you a virtual round of applause and say thank you ever so much for being with us and for stimulating our thinking and giving us an overview of this subject.
Great.
So
thank you again for having me.
Thank you again, and thank you for everybody for being with us and listening. And there'll be another seminar in 2 weeks' time, and we look forward to seeing you again. So good afternoon, everybody.